Okay, so let me start by thanking Mauro, because that was quite an extraordinary piece of documentary. If I may say first, my personal impression, the impression of being able to concentrate in only half an hour all the issues that are concerned with this debate, let's call it a debate, between the receiving countries and the people that come from other countries and try to cross the borders. There are many suggestions in your documentary. Let me start from my own angle, if you allow me, Mauro. My angle is the European Union. I am an official of the European Union and fellow here. And the European Union was mentioned several times in your documentary, sort of a present and absent actor. Although what we have seen represents very much a similar situation in other parts of the world. But let's concentrate on why the European Union is an actor, and actually is an actor by presence and absence. I will try to be very brief on that, but it seems to me important. While I was starting, I opened the Treaty of the European Union in front of me. And I will start by reading out the first sentence of Article 2 of that treaty that says that the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. What we have seen here is a direct challenge to this expression of values. I see the challenges on several aspects. The first challenge is about the safety of these people at sea, because this is an island, and we know that there is an ongoing tragedy in the Mediterranean, not only in that part of the Mediterranean, also in the Aegean area. A lot of refugees are dying trying to cross from the Turkish coasts to the Greek islands, for example. So this is about international law and shared values of all the world, all the states of the world. There is a clear, an existent law of the sea since at least 150, 2,200 years that puts the safeguard of life at sea at the top of every kind of action in the sea. So when somebody is safe at sea, that person must be brought to the mainland and protected. That has been the civilization for all the countries in the world. What we are seeing, and there is some perception here, beyond this lip service to saving lives, there is always a sentence that refers to but. Saving lives, but you have to do this, you have to do that. This but represents actually a refrain from implementing those principles of word understanding of what should be protection of life. The second element is the element that I perceived in this documentary is the separation between the human being and his or her rights. Many of the interviews focused on the belonging to a group. If you belong to a certain group, then you are welcome. If you do not belong to that group, you are no longer welcome. That belonging, it is not clear who should decide on what that belonging means, but certainly that requirement or conditions to belonging is in breach of the values of respect of human dignity, equality, rule of law, and respect for human rights. Why? Because human rights are individual human rights. And respect for human dignity is the respect of the dignity of each individual, not only if they are part of a wider group, be it religious or national. So, and the third element, and I will stop here, and the third element is the conflict between interests. It is interesting from this documentary that there are two levels of interests in competition here. On the one hand, we hear certain interveners stating that there is an interest for Malta and for the European countries to have more and better immigration because we need skillful or even unskilled labor forces. So we need these people to move to our countries. At the same time, that interest is opposed by those, we heard that make coincide the interest of the country with the security of the country. Security means sealing the borders. There is an interesting question which is asked by one of the interveners, why the warships that are crossing the Mediterranean in front, that are preventing that the weapons are smuggled into Libya that has a terrible civil war ongoing, they do not save people at sea. That was the question. Well, the answer may lie in other interveners that have said that what they are interested in is protecting the country, meaning creating a hard border, separating that country from the rest. This is not only in the Mediterranean. You may have an echo on what happens in this country and in other countries in the world. So, Mauro, I will stop here. I detected these three possible lines of exchange, or in any event, these are my comments at this time.
Yeah, for me, as you might have realized, this is a documentary that I say we because I didn't do the documentary just by myself. I did with Lucio, which is a great colleague and also a very good friend of mine. We tried to show something different that is in the published discussion when we talk about migration and refugees. We usually have, and this is something that I also explored in my work in the past, a very emotional image of migrants. So usually when we read that, for example, on a newspaper about migrants, we read when they arrive and when they are drawn. We never read about migrants, about their life, what are they doing in Europe, about the detention center. The only way for these human beings to be somehow, to find someone interested in their life is when they finally arrive to Europe, and we usually call them an invasion, or where they don't arrive because unfortunately they're drawn. And the idea of this documentary was to work on two different levels. On one level was to show the migrant, and I would like them to come back on this definition because we had a discussion previously, and it's interesting also to talk a bit about what we talk about when we talk about migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. We should never forget that, first of all, they are human beings. So the idea was to show these human beings not as people coming from another planet, but just as other human beings like everyone else in the documentary. In the past, in my documentaries, I was inevitably, also because of the context that the documentaries were realized, it were refugee camps, focusing a bit more on their condition. Now I had the idea to put them at the same level with all the other people that was interviewed. And then the most important part of the documentary is to focus on the effects that the perception that we developed in the last 11 years, since 2011, when the so-called Arab Spring started, and we had all this new phenomenon of arrivals reaching Europe. It's how this perception actually had a very strong development in the political life and then on the social perception that we have in Europe. You can see this in the documentary in different ways. There is something that at some point Eric Mouly he mentioned that if actually the African population will decide to truly invade Europe, there will be 1.2 billion people. And this will be impossible to stop. And I think this sentence, what you say, is very important because it gives us an image, a clear image of how wrong is our public discussion about this phenomenon. We continue to stick to this idea of invasion of something that is going to change our culture because we are going to be outnumbered by these human beings arriving. And when we truly look at the numbers, when we truly look at the social effects that these arrivals really made, it's mostly a political construction. And it's a political construction that we can see very well in the documentary, both with this strange couple saying absurd things and with this man from the Popular Party, because they are perfectly the expression of the political effects of this phenomenon. It's every time that I see again the documentary, I can't help but to have a very mixed feeling when this strange couple of friends talk, because at some point it happened in a few screenings that people asked me if these two people, they were for real, or if they were actors. Because at some point it seems a bit that they are playing a screenplay, because it sounds just impossible that they really think. At some point, the men say, why are they coming from Syria? There's no war in Syria. And I mean, being there, listening to that when he told us was a bit absurd. So our goal was to show a bit these effects and to try also to concretely address one of the main problems that as European Union we saw in the last 11 years in connection with the migration phenomenon, which is how many parties on the European political scenario used something that is just a phenomenon, is not a problem, and that concretely has no particular importance on the economical, political, social development of our countries, not for bad at least, maybe it could be for good. And they transformed this phenomenon in fuel for their movements. And we are seeing this everywhere in Europe. And unfortunately, I had the sensation that unless something change, we will continue to see that in the future, and probably not just in Europe, because as you know very well, this has been used very similarly also in the United States.
Let me add another layer, which is sparked by your own comments, Mauro. You link, rightly, the increase and the worsening of the situation to the Arab Spring. This is another paradox of this debate, because the so-called Arab Springs or spring phenomena, because there are many different expressions of that phenomenon in the beginning of the 2010s, they can be maybe summarily summarized by the finally, in some countries, some democratic conscience that has been expressed through the people taking the streets, asking for a change of the government, requesting the change of the structure of the state. Although now the situation is worsened, the best evolution that we saw was Tunisia. Tunisia went through this. There was a dictator which was thrown out, and then some riots, and then elections, and then a truly democratic, although complicated, debate in the state, and then a new constitution. Now we are in a bad turn. I don't know how it will evolve in the future, but we have to see this. And where is the contradiction and the paradox? Because we sort of blame the persons that have been liberated by all these phenomena, all these explosions, social and political explosions, for having done so and having taken their own freedom and their own lives in their own hands and tried to move in places where they could have a better life. So paradoxically, we claim that we defend democracy at home, but as soon as democracy produces unsettlement, diversions, complications in the near border, the only thing we think we should do is to put up a wall, because the people that would reap the benefit of more democracy cannot reach our countries. So we actually promote democracy and blame them for having believed us at the same time. It's a terrible paradox that brings me back to the two lines that I've read you of the European Union Treaty, because if we truly believe in human dignity and human rights, then somewhere there must be not a compromise, but a balance between the need of security and recognition that human beings have a right to move, including crossing borders. Otherwise, that doesn't work. Our narrative is failed. Your reference to these two persons that look like actors, I think you're right, they look like actors. These two persons actually are actors in the sense that possibly they do not truly believe in what they say. Because if they believed in it, then they should show how their own lives are in conformity with the principles that they pronounce are invaluable. I fear that if you had the time to test them, they would have failed to pass that test, because these are normally people who talk about values but do not actually implement them. Because if they implement being, for example, a wholehearted Catholic, how can they make all these people prisoners for months with no respect of the law? How can they push them back to Libya? It's a hell place to be without any right there. And we all know that. How? So there is a part of acting, but that hides behind a clear contradiction between stated principles and actually performance, execution in practice of those values that are claimed so high, so grand.
Actually, about these two men, there is something that can be somehow interesting to share, because in order to keep the documentary a bit more balanced, we had to cut parts that were much more extreme in their expression. Basically, we kept the balanced parts of what they said. There were parts where this man was saying that his political hero is Adolf Hitler, for example, that we didn't put into the documentary because the idea of the documentary, of all my work and all of our work, is to keep the documentary balanced enough so that it's clear our position, but there is also enough space for them to express themselves. And we believe that their ideas don't need any comment because they speak for themselves badly. But we, for example, decided to not push too much and to not put, for example, this Adolf Hitler declaration, because we had the sensation that this way we would unbalance a bit too much the documentary. We wanted to keep to give the audience an hope about also these two men. I must say that I kind of agree when you say that I'm not totally sure if they truly believe in what they say, and I am not talking about them specifically. There is a component, a political component that we can categorize as nationalist, far right, that it's difficult to believe that they will truly stick to the principles that they claim to believe in. Of course, they talk a lot, and they do that also in the documentary, but clearly, day by day, they then act in another way. For example, we decided to use this part when they say that he is a Catholic, and they say a lot of times that he is against abortion, and that in his political discourse there are a lot of words of God, which when you think about what he's saying, it sounds crazy. So he's saying the worst things ever about human beings, but then he's saying that is very Catholic, and we come again there to the contradiction, the human contradiction that constantly come with this, with people that take this, that come from these political components that come again from the effects of the phenomenon. I would like to say something about this last word that I say, phenomenon. We were also discussing this before. Clearly, and Lucio also say there are different responsibilities. The documentary gives some hints about where these responsibilities lay. And it is important for me, the word phenomenon, because one of the main issues is that in the last 11 years, we've been talking all the time of emergency and crisis, and to use the word problem, which is very wrong, because this is not a problem, this is a phenomenon. So one of the issues is that if we continue to address this issue as a problem, we will look for a solution. And of course, we will not find a solution, because this is not a problem. I always do the example that if we will try to find a solution for rain, we will never find a solution. We will continue to get out of our apartment when it's raining, and we will continue to have rain coming on us. But if we will consider this a phenomenon, we will not look for a solution, we will look for something to manage the phenomenon. In case of the rain, we will get a raincoat, we will get an umbrella, we will find a way to manage the phenomenon, which is the same thing that we should do with the migration. This is not a problem, it's a phenomenon, it's something that always happens. Always. The human being is a migrant, and this is never going to stop. And the only goal that we are reaching by addressing this as a problem is fueling the political discourse that we've been seeing in this documentary.
I have a question about another contradiction, probably. You have this woman speaking about insecurity. Can you give a bit of the background of her? Because I might have gotten that wrong, but is she also is she a migrant herself, or yeah?
It's a very interesting question. Also, the fact that you might have thought that she is a migrant. She's a Maltese, and she's speaking Maltese, and we've been looking for somebody speaking Maltese to put in the documentary, because again, this was a clear contradiction of what they were saying. So basically, this woman was talking against people coming from Africa and other countries, speaking a language which is Maltese that clearly sounds Arab, because it's a mixture of different languages where Arab, in terms of sound,
40% is Arabic.
Definitely as a pointer. And she is part of this nationalist organization that also the other two men talk. And what her part is, it's a minor part in the documentary, but it's very important because explain perfectly and graphically one of the issues that we have in Malta, and not just in Malta. In Malta is stronger because it's incredible that she's speaking a language which is 40% Arabic, and that she also look Arabic, and that she feel this distance with the people arriving from countries that clearly contributed to build the place where she lives now, where she's from.
Maybe finally on my side, an additional level of complexity and a problem that your documentary raises so skillfully. It is the notion of migrant. We discussed this before starting the screening, but your work shows it perfectly well. There is this logic of migrants as a category. All these people that come from outside, they're all migrants. What does that mean? Nobody understands it. The only thing that defines them is that they entered some way illegally. Again, if you're running at sea and you are saved, you are not illegal. Not at all. The law says the opposite. Actually, in Malta, it's very difficult to enter the country illegally because unless you reach the coast with your own boat, which is very, very difficult, normally you are saved at sea and brought to the island. And in that situation, you are a legal migrant because you have a right to be saved. Then the question of what, if you have a right to remain in the island, that's a separate matter. But why is it separate? Because in the discourse, the logic of migrant catch-all definition hides the other one, which is mosques. The word mosque is repeated 3 or 4 times. So it hides actually Muslim. Many of these poor persons come, for example, from Ethiopia, that is a Christian country. Several people that come from Sudan are Christians. There is a sizable minority in Egypt of Christian people. How can one, simply looking at a person that has black skin, decide that that is a migrant equal to Muslim? That comes from a label that is attached to their face. And it goes even further because they say one of the last interviews with this person, young person, I understand he is Eritrean or Eritrean. He says they don't let me stay here. There is no future here. Don't try. Don't try to come here because they will kill you on the road in Libya. One understands the dangers through sparse bits and pieces of sentences. But he says also, I would like to have a family here, but I am black. So the second unspoken reason is racism, is the color of the skin. This is the second unspoken. So behind the word migrant hides, again, I come back to my to my article of the Treaty of the European Union, is the denial of a human dignity as an individual, because we simply don't look at the person. We look at the image we think that person projects. And if that person comes from Africa and that person happens to be a black person, automatically that is a migrant to be rejected because it means Muslim and different from me. So this is what I felt very strongly. So there is, in my view, an urgency to fight against this direct labeling that has become omnipresent and is fueling the extreme right discourse.
There is there is something that again in this direction I would like to add, and it is a way a bit the soul of the documentary. In the documentary, we try to work on the distance between again the perception that the society has of migration and the reality, and we saw this very clearly in this documentary. So there is a construction of an idea of invasion and difference and distance and migrants and not human beings coming from another planet, while the reality is that we are just talking of persons, human beings like us. I always make this example, which is, I don't know if you are familiar with the geographical position of Sicily, but I will try to explain you for a moment. Sicily, which is one of the southern part of Europe, as its southern point, it's actually southern than Tunisia. And the difference between a person that was born in the south of Sicily and a person that was born in Tunisia is just the passport. It's nothing that, it's not a right that I acquired because I am particularly intelligent or because I did something for that. I just was born in a place that gave me a passport that gave me the possibility to travel wherever I want. And then a person which is by boat just 2 hours from my coast has a different passport, and his air life is a nightmare if you want to travel. So we're talking of people that share the same sea. One of these areas, Sicily, is a bit southern than the other one. I have a passport to give me the chance to travel wherever I want. As another Mauro, 39 years old in Tunisia, has a much more miserable life just because he was born a bit of kilometers southern. When we think about this, we realize that our policy in terms of migration is grounded on something that is absolutely unacceptable, which has no humanity at all. And when we just think about policy of Italian governments and of many other governments in Europe, also northern countries, that don't take resolutions in order to make this kind of phenomenon something that is managed with one only thing in mind, which is solidarity, it's incredible. It's incredible that in 2022, we are still discussing and talking about the way that we should work in this phenomenon, about what we should do, because it's clear. It's not particularly complicated. It's complicated on the political side, maybe to find a way, but on the humanitarian side, this should not be so complicated to understand. It's just that we slowly became prisoners of these perceptions of ourselves based on nothing, just because we were born in a country instead of another, which is something that can't define the rights that we have. It's incredible that rights are different if you're born in Italy or if you're born in Tunisia. It doesn't make any sense, but this is what it is.
Can I ask about, there is one scene with the students, I'm not particularly clear, but is there a certain intentions from your side showing that, because those two are like working students. So what is it that you would like to convey in that kind of particular scene, especially when he's also talking about these different people trying to contact him to come to Malta, and he understands himself as someone could not encourage people from there to come. He's so well aware how he situated himself. Like, I can't be too welcoming. I can also be realist about this. So is it a particular side perspective that you want to try to shape?
Yeah. The idea, first of all, for example, we decided to not put in the titles the country of origin because we didn't want to put another label. We didn't do for all the others people interviewed. We didn't put Italy, Malta, and we didn't want to do that with the refugees. So this was a specific choice that we didn't do, for example, in the other two previous documentaries, the third part of the trilogy. In the other documentaries, we decided to put. And the idea was we strongly tried to give an image of the refugees as less emotional as we could. Usually in this kind of contents, the image of the refugees that we see inevitably, also because of the context, are very emotional. Are images that you see the documentary and sometimes you can't help but to cry because their stories and their conditions are difficult. We wanted to completely change this narrative in this documentary, not because we want to deny the other one, but because we wanted to show something completely different. That's why we for example, you mentioned it, we wrote working student and not just refugee, because we wanted to make clear that these are human beings that are trying to live in this country, to study and to work at a cost of enormous sacrifices, because it's not easy at all. So the idea was to humanize them as much as possible, trying to put them out of this categorization that inevitably we put them in when we look at them in context like refugee camps, or when they just arrived after a 3 days trip in the Mediterranean, but to give to the audience the perception that these are not Maltese. In 10 years, hopefully, these are Maltese working and living. And that's also why we wanted to close the documentary with this young guy saying, actually, don't come. This is difficult. Because again, the narrative usually is like, come, it's easy. It's not like that. And actually, when you work for a while on the subject of migration in this part of the world, which I did now for more than 10 years, you realize story after story that a very small minority of these people really wanted to come to Europe. They've been forced to come to Europe. It's something that come out many times in the documentary, but I had the possibility to experience very well. Lucio was talking a bit of Arab Springs, which is, of course, the historical, a very important historical point for all this migration thing. And when the war started in Libya, there are millions of Africans from everywhere in Africa working in Libya that they have absolutely no interest in coming to Europe, that are working in Libya and getting salaries that most of the times are better than the ones that we get in Sicily. And they are not thinking at all to come to Europe. Of course, to make clear, I'm not defending Gaddafi, but this is to say that...
that was the situation.
Yeah, exactly. That
is a fact.
A lot of, mostly the people that arrive in Europe. And I would say, I know a bit less, but I would say that probably it's the same in the United States. People arriving in the United States would probably prefer to just stay at home with their family in their country of origin. It's not always possible. And this documentary show it a bit, this from another side, a side that try to humanize as much as possible the human being.
I think that I understood at least one, maybe two of the speakers to express an opinion that the European Union was not sufficient in its policies. Am I right that both of those speakers, or the one, if there was only one, was in fact Maltese and not migrant? But it's an interesting question what they think should be better about European Union's policy insofar as it exists, and whether what they expect to improve should legitimately be hoped for, or whether they're just dreaming about something that could be better, that is realistically not likely to happen.
I would say something about this, and then I will leave also to Lucio, that has very important experience about this. Actually, one of the I suppose that you are talking about the woman that is speaking in Italian. She is the director of an NGO that is rescuing people between in the Mediterranean. And talking about, there are many things that European institutions could do better. I will address one, and then I will leave to Lucio, that has a lot of experience again about this, which is the Dublin Convention. Under this rule, which is a European Union rule, when a human being, let's try to use this word, when a human being reach Europe, is allowed to ask for asylum just in the country of arrival and not in another country. So if a migrant arriving in Malta can ask for a political asylum just in Malta, cannot travel to Italy or to Germany or to France, or either cannot ask for asylum in France from Malta, to France from Malta, can just do that in Malta. This is a huge problem for many reasons. First of all, because of course the southern countries of Europe have a disproportionate amount of responsibility in comparison with the northern countries of Europe, but also because mostly, of course, the human beings arriving don't want to stay in the southern part of Europe, but would like to go in the northern part of Europe. And also because in the specific case of Malta, and you can probably imagine that very easily, most of the human beings arriving in Malta, they don't know what Malta is, of course. They took a boat from the North Africa, thinking they would reach Europe, and they end in Malta, which is a very small island in the middle of the Mediterranean. They didn't know it existed. They didn't know it's a country. Can you imagine? They are there and they are stuck there. They basically can't move from there. They can go anywhere else. They can either get an asylum, political asylum there, or move back, which had another layer of problems to what I say. And I will leave to Lucio, that definitely have something to say about this.
Maybe I will try to be systematic but short, because this is a huge question you are raising, actually. First, you said, insofar as there is a policy, don't be mistaken, there is a policy. Europe, the European Union, has deployed a significant force of protection of the border called Frontex, which is very, very powerful. It is mentioned in the documentary. Frontex, what is Frontex? Frontex is a quasi-federalized agency that complements the control of the external borders of the Union in the areas that have particular difficulties that are now widespread, because with the recent Belarus crisis, then we have it in the Baltics, we have them down in Bulgaria versus Turkey, we have them in Greece, we have them in Italy and Malta, and now also in the Canary Islands because of the crossings from Morocco. So you see that this is now spread around. We are talking about numbers that are becoming serious. Over 10,000 men and women permanently employed, and they have a couple of billions of euros available, which is equal to a couple of billions of dollars. So although it's not huge numbers, it becomes a serious number. And that makes a difference. They are patrolling. They dispose of the best equipment in terms of satellite control. They use the same kind of satellite systems that the military and the Navy of NATO uses in the Mediterranean. They're sharing the same kind of equipment. So they are extremely sophisticated, close to what you see with the Homeland Security that has been developed here. And that's a policy. So that was not existent 10 years ago. The sacrosanct protection of the frontiers of your country, that was considered by the patriots to be in for the countries. European Union, nothing to do. And no, all the extremists or less extremists of Europe are now behind the existence of a federal European Union policy concerned with Frontex. But when it comes to a federal, quasi-federal approach to the influx of these human beings that is generically labeled as migrants, then there it disappears. Why? Because the main drive there is what you have heard in this documentary. Protection of your country means protection of your culture, protection of your customs, protection of your religion. Hence, each state keeps it to itself. So the Dublin Treaty or Dublin Agreement, which is now translated into European Union regulations, it's actually very progressive in terms of asylum seeking rights. There is a wealth of legislation that is actually very progressive. And I can state without exaggerating that it is one of the most progressive in the world. The problem is the limitation that Mauro is indicating. So what is lacking is exactly that crossing. We like having a federalized police at the border. We don't like having a federalized policy of distributing the people, because the problem is not with the moment when you disembark. Somebody should know that if that person disembarks in Malta, it's Malta taking care of the identification and providing or not the status of refugee, for example. All right? That could be perfectly okay, provided that Malta is not stuck with all these people that do not go anywhere. So the redistribution is the problem behind. And redistribution hits the wall of this kind of discourse that you have heard in the documentary. Yes, and unfortunately, I have to say, is the same debate that you have here in the United States, identical. I can mention one person, although I don't know if this is kosher enough or not, but if I mention Mr. Bannon, Steve Bannon, you may have heard of him, former aide of Mr. Trump. He was pursuing the same policies in Europe throughout. He is called as a guru by certain quarters in European politics. There is a clear direct connection even through the same persons on the two sides of the Atlantic. So we are confronted to a generational, cultural, and therefore political issue here. And sorry to come back to my starting point of this exchange, human dignity and human rights are individual. We cannot dispose of groups of people undefined as migrants and keep them like parcels in a warehouse somewhere in one country or the other. That we need to solve. We must solve it. It's unsustainable.
So can I follow up? So what happened when they are in Malta? So we're talking about like the government was stuck with people not there. And then so I'm just this with the
what happens?
What happened after that? And people
but what happens before also? Because if you are in Malta and you are stuck with all these people, the question that you are asking is what happens next? If I am an asylum seeker and I am given asylum status because in my country I cannot go back, Eritrea and Ethiopia, Sudan are clear examples. You cannot push these people back. Not only it's inhuman, it's in violation of existing international conventions, like the Refugee Convention of 1951 of the UN, no? So we cannot do it. So Malta is stuck with these people, they must keep them. So what is the alternative for Malta? Push back as many as possible, because we heard that as again, we cannot get more, which is not entirely correct, because this is a perception. No? We are full of what? There is full of requests of people working and doing jobs that nobody takes in Malta as much as in Italy and elsewhere. But this idea that if we open up the working opportunities, here I come with the word, then you open up to a pull factor. This is the word in politics in Europe and also in this state, in this country. Pull factor, meaning you actually incite people to come because they will find work. So you don't give them anything. So that it shows exemplarily that it's useless to come. So what happens is before and after. After, you keep them completely separated to make it an example for the outside. And before, you make it sure that you take them the least possible, including one creates problems to the NGOs that save people at sea. This case I was involved in, that had its judgment the 1st of August was exactly about that. Italy putting all possible obstacles to the NGOs that save people at sea. Why? Because by doing that, the pull factor is diminished. People should know that if they try to cross, they will die. So they don't come. Nothing of that, neither before nor after, seems to me in line with the principles. They are not. I think it is objective. It is not a simple perception.
Absolutely. And also to add something which is very banal, but I think, again, we come back to the same image. It's important to insist. You asked what happened when they after they arrived. Basically, one thing which is one more time absurd. There is an officer at some point deciding if this human being traveled to Malta as an economical migrant or as an asylum seeker. So there is somebody from an office deciding this. There will be an interview, and they will even check if you have scars, if you have a psychological situation that might be related to some kind of violence you suffered in your country of origin. And then after this interview and after the review of your psychological case, your physical case, the country you're coming, they will decide, okay, you are traveling here because there is a problem in your country, or you're traveling here just because you want a better future. The second case, you are denied asylum, of course, because to want a better future is not enough to come to Europe. In the first case, if you clearly show signs of problems from your country of origin, then you might be allowed to stay with a status of refugee, which then lead again to all the complications, because when you got your refugee status, this is also important, but this would be a very long discussion, because sometimes we have this sensation that, okay, you got your refugee status, now your life is paradise. It's not exactly. Also, the refugee status actually that is not guaranteeing a very necessarily an happy life. It's good. It's a good way to start, unless you have the right to stay in Europe. But still, there are a lot of limitations and a lot of criteria that you continuously need to reaffirm in order to stay.
Okay, so thank you very much to both of you, Lucio Gussetti, visiting fellow at the European Studies Council, and to Mauro Mondello for your discussions, very fruitful discussions that we had on the topic, and I hope then to be able to have you back at another opportunity with your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.